Today is Monday. It's actually the day after the phenomenal sermon by Pastor James on the road less traveled. Now, I am preaching the sermon today from the road, but I actually preached this sermon Thursday, which was about 10 days before you will actually hear the sermon on today. And you may ask, well, why did you preach it so long ago? Because on that Thursday, God simply told me, I want you to preach the sermon today. We were staying at a fairly nice hotel and they had a nice lobby and I was going to do it there. He said, nope, you do it on the trail. So we found a spot a few miles into the trail. I set up my tripod and I began to preach the sermon. But the funny thing is, as I began to preach the sermon, people started to stop. And before I finished, there was a gallery of people listening to the sermon. And even when we went to another town, as we were walking, they actually called out from a restaurant the title of the sermon. So that was one thing. I had no idea that I'd have a congregation on the road. But on Saturday, Nate and I were sitting at dinner, and the man who was sitting next to me began to ask me why I was walking the El Camino. And I told him that it was spiritual, it was a heavenly command, and he then asked could he talk with me. And we talked about an hour after dinner, and he asked something about a particular portion of the Bible, and I said, well, actually, I just did a sermon on that. And I let him watch the sermon. And I saw him there riveted to it. And when the sermon ended, his eyes were watery. Sometimes you never know what God has. You never know the purpose. You never know the why. Sometimes you find out later. Sometimes you may never find out. So we have seen the gallery watching the sermon. I've seen a man impacted from the sermon. And this was a week and a day before it is to be preached. And that's why God had me to do it early, because he knew the man would be there and the man would need to hear the message. And he was actually from Germany. So as we travel this road, the sermon that you shall hear today was actually preached over a week ago. And almost 2 weeks ago. But God knew the what and the why, and prepared today to receive the sermon from the road. This is Pastor Nathaniel, and I am here again for my second message from the El Camino Trail in the country of Spain. And as you know, I have been doing a series based on contentment. And it began when I was in prayer with our youngest son, George, and God simply says, have him to give the words that go along with each letter of the word contentment. C was care. O was opinion. N was new. T was time. And then we went to E, which was done last 2 weeks on the trail on the subject of excessive. And today I'm going to do what George spoke for the letter N, which is simply neighbor. Now, neighbor is an interesting word. It is actually one of the foundations of what Jesus taught. When the wise people asked Jesus, and the young man asked, what are the commandments? What are the greatest things? And Jesus simply says this. He says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, and strength. In other words, with everything that you have. And the second thing he said was this. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, I remember preaching a sermon years ago called the roughest verse in the Bible. And this verse had to do with if you love God, then you will hate money. And I said, that was a rough verse. That was one of the hardest things I've ever seen. Because if you love one, you will hate the other. If you appreciate one, you will despise the other. I said, anybody who loves God, I just don't know anyone who just hates money. So I said, that was the roughest verse in the Bible. But I must admit, to love thy neighbor as thyself probably counts as the second roughest verse in the Bible. And the simple reason for that is this. You've got some rough neighbors. And not only do you have rough neighbors, you have rough relatives, and many of you have rough people even in your own households, even in your own bed. Because it's not so much the neighbor who is distant that we have a problem with. It's the neighbor who is close to us that we have a problem with. And when the man asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? He gave the story or the parable of the Good Samaritan, where there was a man by the side of the road who had been beaten and robbed and left for dead. And the priest passed by and left him there. The Samaritan was the only one who took the man in, cleansed his wounds, bandaged his wounds, put him up in an inn, and said, I will pay on my way back whatever the charges are in addition to what I'm leaving now. The priest passed him by, the Levite passed him by. And Jesus used this parable as the parable for who is thy neighbor. And I want to talk to you today from just even the subject of contentment and that word of neighbor, so that even we begin to look at those who are close around us. And I'm not talking about somebody in the next household. We often have to get things straight within our own households. And Jesus says to love thy neighbor, but actually this is not a New Testament thing. If you study your Bible, it's in the Old Testament. For God told you, even in the book of Leviticus, to love thy neighbor as thyself. So it was in Leviticus just as it is in the New Testament. So it is a foundational part. But I got to believe that's probably one of the second roughest verse in the Bible, because the human nature is to love ourselves. It is not to love others as we love ourselves. Now, sometimes when you have a mother's love, yes. When she has a child, a mother will often die for that child. But that same love does not extend beyond her own children. It does not extend as a general rule to the neighbor. So how do we get to the point of where we love our neighbor? And I really believe that charity begins at home and love begins at home, and you will never love those distant until we master first loving those at home. My wife and I, we have 4 boys. And I only remember the words that I first spoke to each of the boys. I only remember the words to one of them. And that was our youngest son, George. And I remember holding him in my arms before he could walk. And I remember speaking the words to him, Daddy loves you. And I never will forget his response. I had never heard him talk. I didn't even realize he could talk. And he spoke the words, I know, I know, I know. And the challenge that so many of us have, we don't even tell our own blood that we love them. Husband and wives, they don't tell each other on any sort of regular basis, I love you. And Jesus says, he says, how can you love God whom you have not seen? And you don't love your brother whom you have seen. That's a real good question, because I don't know anyone who has seen God. I mean, we've seen his works, we've seen his manifestations, we may have felt his power and his love, but I don't know anyone who has actually seen God. So Jesus says, how can you love God? And this is the first commandment, to love God basically with everything that you've got. And he says, how can you love God whom you have not seen? And you don't love your own brother whom you have seen. Now, I believe that this command, it has a particular relevance to what I would call that one. Some people are easy to love. Some people have a grace, they have a kindness about them, they have a consideration about them that makes them extremely easy to love. But some people are difficult. You all understand what I mean? Some people are difficult to love. Not only are they difficult to love, they're difficult not to hate. Some people have selfish motives, they're inconsiderate, they're mean, you understand what I mean? All of us know people like that. And this is the challenge. And some of us even have people like that within our own bloodlines. You've got what I call that one. And it is that one that Jesus is talking about. That we need to be able to love that one. Even within this church, the vast majority of people in this church are nice, they're neighborly, they're just really, really lovable. But some of you know that one. And it is that one that you have a problem with. It is that one that you really don't love that much. It is that one that you really don't want to speak to. It is that one that Jesus tells you to love. Because, even the mafia is good to folk who good to them. It takes someone with an elevated spirit to love and be good to someone who does not reciprocate that same love and affection. And I remember when I asked God my personal commands for what do I need for myself and my family. And he gave me these commands. He said, first of all, serve me. But the second one was, be in correct fellowship with your brother. He didn't say brothers, because I've got 4 brothers. He didn't say brothers. He said brother, because there's always that one. And I wondered, why didn't God tell me to be in correct fellowship with my wife, be in correct fellowship with my children? Why did he say be in correct fellowship with my brother? Probably for the same reason Jesus said, if you don't love your brother, how can you love God? Because it is that one in your life that you have an issue with. But you will never love that one until you can begin to express the love for those who you don't have an issue with. And in today's society, we just don't do that. I'm here on this trail with my oldest son. And as I thought about it, I cannot remember the last time I told my son that I loved him. Men just aren't like that. We're macho and he-men, and we've got all of this testosterone, and somehow it seems to be too effeminate, to be too delicate to tell another man, a son, that you love them. But if God the Father is love, and if he can say he loves us, why is it that men have such a difficulty telling another man that they love them? Why? So I want to call my son over here right now. Hey, would you just come over here right now? And sometimes you all may need to do this very day. Don't wait another day to do this. Don't wait another week or another month until the time feels right to. You need to tell some people who are close to you that you love them. I want to just let you know, Daddy loves you. Daddy has always loved you. Can you remember the last time Daddy told you that he loved you? No. He can't remember. See, he cannot remember the last time. And see, my father, I had one of the greatest fathers ever to walk the earth. But I can never remember my daddy telling me that he loved me. I knew he did. He spent the time, he spent the energy, he spent the focus on me. I knew without question that my daddy loved me. But I can never remember him saying so. And so it is with so many of us. It is not even the neighbor who is distant. It is those who are close that we don't take the time to say, I love you. My closest friend is my brother James. I don't remember when the last time, or if I have ever told James that I love him. I talk to him literally every day. Even here in Spain, and he's back in the U.S., I talk to him every day. But I cannot remember ever telling him that I love him. James, I want to let you know I love you. My brother C. Elijah is sitting there. C. Elijah, I want to let you know that I love you. Bernard is there. Bernard, I want to let you know I love you. Dale, if you ever hear this message, I want to let you know I love you. We don't tell those who are close to us that we love them. And yet Jesus said, How can you say you love God whom you have not seen, and you do not love your brother whom you have seen? It is a challenge that we all face. And it is a challenge that we need to overcome, particularly men. My wife is listening to this message. Sweetheart, I love you. And we don't tell each other that enough. And I remember even going back to George, I can remember he was the first child that I can remember telling I love them. I remember those were the first words that I spoke to him. But George and I, as we started praying in the morning, George would start saying, as we ended the day and ended the prayer session, he would say, I love you. And it sort of shook me because none of my other sons would tell their daddy, I love you. I was talking to my other son, Christian, on yesterday. And right before we hung up, Christian said, Daddy, I love you. Do you know what it does to a man? Do you know what it does to a woman? Do you know what it does to a child when they are told they are loved? It doesn't just change them, it changes you. And this is something that all of us in this busy, macho, testosterone-charged world need to focus on, and we need to do. Not to just love our neighbor who is next door or in the next town or the next country, but we need to love the people who are in the next room or the next bed or someone whom we can even reach over and touch every single night. How can you say you love God whom you have not seen, and you do not love your brother whom you have seen? So this is a charge that I make to all of you. Today, start and continue. And don't just let it be a message that, well, I'm going to do this today. Start and continue every single day. Tell someone that you love them. It will change you, and it will change them. It will take you to commitment. It will take you to a consecration. It will take you to contentment. Neighbor. Love thy neighbor as thyself. This is going to be a relatively short message today because I am going to ask in the few minutes that are remaining in this session, I want my brother C. Elijah, I want my brother James, and I want my son George and my son Christian to just make a few comments after this closes. I'll have about 7 or 8 minutes left on this message, and I want them to feel that message, to feel that time, and I want them all to know that I love them. And as a congregation, I want you to know that I love you and I appreciate you. This is Pastor Nathaniel from the El Camino Trail in Spain. I love you. Josie's, I don't know whether you're there today or not, but if you are there, I want to let you know I love you. And if you're not there, I want to let you know I love you. All of my sons, my wife, and all of my brothers, and to the congregation. And Josie's, I know that you're not moving into the ministerial, but if you want to have a word along with the rest of your brothers who are there, then by all means, go ahead and do so. This is Daddy, and Daddy loves you. I saw the gentleman from Germany a few minutes ago as we were sitting outside of a cafe, and he stopped and he said, you know the song that you told me, your favorite gospel song? He'd asked me what was my favorite gospel song, because he actually sings in a German gospel choir. And he said their artist that they model after is Kurt Carr.
Distance, 13 kilometers, split average speed, 4.91 kilometers per hour.
And he asked me what was my favorite gospel song. I told him it was Travis Green, You Made a Way. And we sat there and listened to it. He said that he and another person listened to that song this morning, and he said it just brought tears to their eyes. So you just never know what all God is doing. But I can tell you this, God is always good, and God is still speaking. He's still performing miracles, even when they're small miracles. And he is still moving through his people. He is still moving through you. We were just walking in the next town, and there were people sitting outside eating at a restaurant. Nate, tell them what they hollered out to us.
I love you, brother.
Love your brother. They were part of the group who sat there and listened to the sermon. You never know what purpose God has. You never know the what, the who, the why, and the when. But God always knows. Love you, brother.
From brothers of